the most degenerate incestuous communities in the USA, what remained after decades of deformed descendants. A dark and disturbing reality hides in the depths of certain isolated regions of America, where genetic intertwining between close relatives has resulted in generations of silent suffering that few dare to mention. It's 1947, in the heart of the Appalachians, a mountainous region that stretches across several eastern American states. The deep valleys and steep mountains created pockets of isolation, where entire communities remained separated from the rest of civilization for decades, sometimes centuries. One such community was established in the late 19th century in a remote valley of Pine Mountain, Kentucky, by three pioneer families, the Hartleys, the Dawsons, and the McAllisters. The extreme geographical isolation, combined with distrust of outsiders, created the perfect conditions for practices of union between close relatives to become not only accepted but institutionalized as family tradition. This is the case of the Dawson family, whose dark history only came to light when public health authorities visited the region in 1947, alerted by reports of unusual medical conditions affecting multiple members of the community. Dr. A. Robert Caldwell, a physician sent by the Kentucky Department of Public Health, documented his findings in a confidential report that remained archived for decades. What I found in Pine Mountain defies human understanding and raises disturbing questions about what happens when communities completely isolate themselves from modern society, he wrote in his personal notes. The Dawson family, led by patriarch Elijah Dawson, then 67, had established a pattern of marriages between cousins for at least 4 generations. Over time, this endogamous circle closed even further, resulting in unions between siblings, uncles and nieces, and even between fathers and daughters. The result was a community where almost everyone shared a dangerously similar genetic load. When Dr. Caldwell arrived at the valley, he was met with hostility. The Dawson community lived in a collection of rustic cabins scattered along a mountain stream. What impressed him most was the oppressive silence that hung over the place. There were no children playing or running as one would expect, just suspicious glances from people hiding behind tattered curtains, he reported. It was only with the help of Martha Dawson, a 19-year-old who had managed to attend a school in the nearest town for a few years before being forced to return, that Caldwell gained access to the community. Martha, born from a relationship between first cousins, who were in turn children of cousins, was one of the few who did not present obvious physical characteristics of the family's prolonged consanguinity. Doctor, no one from here ever leaves. And those who leave don't come back, Martha explained in her first meeting with Caldwell. We are different, and they know it out there. The reality that the doctor documented in the following weeks was devastating. Among approximately 40 members of the Dawson community, he identified an alarming pattern of medical conditions: reduced stature, facial malformations, extra fingers on hands and feet, congenital heart problems, and, most disturbingly, a high rate of cognitive delay. Of the 12 children born in the last 10 years, 9 had some degree of intellectual impairment. The most emblematic case was Samuel Dawson, 12, son of first cousins who were, in turn, children of siblings who married their own cousins. Samuel had a disproportionately small head, widely spaced eyes, short stature for his age, and inability to speak more than a few simple words. His younger brother Joseph, 8, had been born with a serious heart defect and 5 fingers on each hand. The isolation is not just geographic, but genetic, wrote Caldwell. Each birth perpetuates and intensifies recessive traits that, in a more diverse population, would rarely manifest. Patriarch Elijah fiercely defended what he called family purity. In a rare conversation with the doctor, he stated, "The Dawson blood is strong. We don't need strangers to weaken what we've built here." Later, Caldwell discovered that this belief had roots in the family's traumatic past. The first Dawsons had fled religious persecution in the 1880s, settling in this remote valley with the belief that the outside world was corrupted and that only by keeping completely separate could they preserve their spiritual salvation. The most alarming situation the doctor documented involved Jeremiah Dawson's immediate family, Elijah's son, who had married his half-sister Rebecca. Of the 6 children born from this union, only 3 survived beyond infancy. All presented distinctive physical characteristics: asymmetric face, underdeveloped jaw, and severe vision problems. 2 could not walk without assistance due to bone malformations in their legs. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. Stories like the Dawsons remain hidden for decades, and only here do you have access to in-depth investigations into these families forgotten by official history. Subscribe now to not miss any detail of this disturbing journey through the darkest secrets of rural America. Dr. Caldwell's report on the Dawsons triggered a broader investigation that revealed similar patterns in neighboring communities. In the adjacent valley, the Hartleys maintained similar practices, albeit on a smaller scale. The crucial difference was that they occasionally allowed marriages with members of other isolated families in the region. This small difference resulted in visibly distinct genetic effects. While the Dawsons presented more severe conditions, the Hartleys demonstrated a milder pattern, though equally concerning, of genetic anomalies. Dr. Caldwell observed that this represented clear evidence of the impact of genetic variation, even minimal, on population health. The Hartleys show us what could happen if the Dawsons had allowed even a minimum of genetic diversity in their lineage, noted the doctor. The difference is significant, although we are still observing deeply problematic results. The Hartley family patriarch, Thomas, 58, had established a less rigid rule. Marriages between first cousins were allowed, but unions between siblings were prohibited. This small distinction resulted in a community where extreme physical conditions were less prevalent, but still present. In 1949, the case of the Pine Mountain communities caught the attention of Dr. Eleanor Fleming, a geneticist from Columbia University, who had studied the effects of inbreeding in isolated populations. With limited permission and under constant surveillance from local patriarchs, she managed to collect blood samples from some members who consented to participate in the study. What we found in Pine Mountain represents an extreme case of genetic drift in isolated populations, Fleming wrote in 1952 in a scientific paper that omitted specific names and locations to protect the communities. When a population reproduces exclusively within a very small group for several generations, certain genetic variants may be amplified or eliminated by mere chance, resulting in allele frequencies very different from general populations. Fleming's studies showed that, in the most endogamous families like the Dawsons, the coefficient of inbreeding, a measure that quantifies the probability of an individual inheriting identical alleles from common ancestors, reached alarming levels of up to 25%, equivalent to the genetic sharing between parent and child or siblings. One of the most disturbing aspects documented by both Caldwell and Fleming was the psychological and social impact on children born from these unions. Daniel Dawson, a 14-year-old boy born from the union of second cousins, who were in turn children of cousins, had a distinctive physical appearance that made him a target of ridicule on the rare occasions when he interacted with people from outside the community. The widely spaced eyes, receding chin, and unusual facial proportions made Daniel immediately identifiable as different, reported Fleming. During our interview, he kept his gaze down constantly and spoke in almost inaudible whispers, showing clear signs of deep social trauma. Martha Dawson, who initially helped Dr. Caldwell gain access to the community, revealed in subsequent conversations with Fleming that many of the young women in the community lived in a constant state of silent despair. "Nobody asks what we want," she confided. "When the time comes, they simply tell us who we're going to marry. Some try to run away, but where to go? Without education, without money, without knowing anyone out there, the situation of the McAllisters, the third original family in the valley, offered a revealing contrast. Although they had started with similar practices of marriages between relatives, a family dispute in the 1920s resulted in several young members leaving the community. Those who remained eventually were forced to seek partners in neighboring communities. As a result, in the younger generation of McAllisters, genetic conditions were notably less prevalent. William McAllister, then 61, reported to Fleming, "My father used to say that pure blood was strong blood. After I saw my nephews being born that way, I started to think differently." The "that way" William was referring to were the severe deformities that affected almost 70% of children born in families with higher rates of consanguinity. Medical records compiled by Caldwell documented cases of polydactyly, extra fingers, syndactyly, fusion of fingers, microcephaly, congenital heart defects, and various degrees of cognitive impairment. Dr. Fleming observed a disturbing pattern. With each successive generation of consanguineous marriages, the severity of conditions increased and the infant mortality rate rose dramatically. In families with the longest history of unions between close relatives, up to 60% of children died before reaching 5 years of age. Investigations in the Pine Mountain communities also revealed a disturbing social phenomenon. As the physical effects of inbreeding became more evident, families isolated themselves even more, fearing stigma and persecution. This isolation, in turn, intensified the problem, creating a vicious cycle that perpetuated for generations. What we witness here, concluded Fleming, is not just a medical tragedy but a human one. These families, trapped in cycles of geographic, social, and genetic isolation, have unwittingly created conditions that perpetuate their own suffering. In 1953, the situation in Pine Mountain took a dramatic turn when a 16-year-old girl, Ruth Dawson, managed to escape from the community and reach the town of Harlan, about 30 kilometers away. Exhausted and disoriented, Ruth was found by a local police officer who, alarmed by her physical appearance and emotional state, took her to the town hospital. Dr. James Harrington, the physician responsible for the case, was immediately intrigued by the young woman's unusual physical characteristics and her fragmented story about the isolated community she had fled from. The patient shows clear signs of congenital malformations consistent with a history of prolonged consanguinity, he recorded in his initial report. Her account of practices of marriages between close relatives in her community of origin is extremely concerning. Ruth revealed that she had fled to avoid an arranged marriage with her maternal uncle, a 42-year-old man who had already had 2 previous wives, both deceased during childbirth. "I saw what happened to my cousins," Ruth reported to Dr. Harrington. "I saw how their children were born. I didn't want that for myself." Ruth Dawson's case reached local newspapers, though with limited details to protect her identity. The headline of the Harlan Daily Enterprise on May 7, 1953, merely stated, "Young woman flees isolated community, reports disturbing marriage practices." This public exposure, even limited, triggered a response from state authorities. The Kentucky Department of Child Welfare sent social workers to investigate conditions in the Pine Mountain community, accompanied by public health officials and local police. When the delegation arrived at the Dawson Valley on May 15, 1953, they found a community in apparent abandonment. Cabins were empty, personal belongings left behind, as if residents had departed in haste. Of the approximately 40 members of the Dawson family documented by Dr. Caldwell 6 years earlier, there was no sign. "It seemed to me that they simply disappeared into the forest like ghosts," wrote Sarah Jenkins, a social worker who participated in the expedition. "We found evidence that they had left recently. Still fresh food remains, still warm stoves. Clearly, someone had alerted them about our arrival." Only months later, through information provided by local hunters, authorities discovered that the Dawsons had relocated to an even more remote area in the Cumberland Mountains, approximately 80 kilometers to the north, near the Virginia border. This new location was practically inaccessible by vehicles, requiring an arduous walk of several days through mountainous terrain. If we realize anything from the Dawson case, it's that self-imposed isolation can be stronger than any external intervention, observed Dr. Fleming in a subsequent report. When a community is convinced that its survival depends on remaining separate from the outside world, it will find ways to maintain that separation, no matter the cost. Meanwhile, Ruth Dawson, under the protection of state social services, began a difficult process of adaptation to life outside her isolated community. Initially placed in a temporary foster home, she faced significant challenges of integration. "The patient demonstrates extreme difficulty with basic concepts of modern life," reported her social worker in August 1953. She was terrified the first time she saw a television, believing it to be some kind of magic window. Her formal education is virtually non-existent, and her understanding of the outside world was shaped primarily by distorted stories told by community elders. Have you ever wondered what would lead entire families to isolate themselves from the world and perpetuate practices that cause so much suffering to future generations? Feel free to share in the comments. May God protect these innocent children. This is the reaction many have when learning about cases like the Dawsons, where the true price of extreme isolation is paid by the most vulnerable. In 1955, 2 years after her escape, Ruth gave an anonymous interview to a psychologist from the University of Kentucky who was studying isolated communities. This interview, preserved in the university archives, offers a rare glimpse into life within an extremely closed endogamous community. "As long as I can remember, I heard that the outside world was dangerous and sinful," reported Ruth. "My grandfather Elijah said our blood was special, chosen, and that mixing it with strangers would weaken us. When children were born different, he said it was because someone had disobeyed in the past, bringing the curse to our family." Ruth described a social system where marriages were decided exclusively by male elders of the family, usually when girls were between 13 and 16 years old. The choice of partners was made based on practical considerations, such as distribution of land and resources, without any consultation with the young people involved. "Some girls tried to run away like I did. Others found other means of escape," reported Ruth, obliquely referring to suicide cases that, according to her, were not uncommon among the young women of the community. "The elders said it was the weakness of the spirit, but we knew the truth." The 1960s brought significant changes to the mountainous regions of Eastern America. President Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty directed unprecedented attention and resources to the Appalachians, one of the most impoverished regions in the country. Federal programs sent doctors, teachers, and social workers to areas that had remained virtually untouched by modernity. In 1964, a mobile medical team from the Appalachian Regional Commission program reached the area where the Dawsons were believed to have relocated. What they found was surprising. The community had fragmented into small family groups dispersed over an extensive area, each living in extreme isolation. Dr. Margaret Holloway, who led the medical team, documented her encounters with these isolated groups. "In more than 20 years of medical practice, I have never witnessed such a high concentration of genetic conditions in a single population. In one cabin we visited, inhabited by 7 people identified as members of the Dawson family, 5 had obvious physical malformations, and all demonstrated some degree of cognitive impairment." Dr. Holloway's notes reveal disturbing details about the state of the dispersed community. In one location, she found a young woman of approximately 20 years with distinctive facial features, widely spaced eyes, prominent forehead, and receding chin, caring for 3 small children who presented similar conditions. The young woman, who identified herself only as Sarah, revealed that she was both mother and first cousin to the children. "When I asked about the father of the children," wrote Holloway, "Sarah pointed to a photograph on the wall showing an elderly man she identified as her uncle. The casualness with which this information was shared suggests a deeply rooted normalization of consanguineous marriage practices." In another location, the team found an even more alarming situation: 2 adult siblings, both with physical characteristics indicative of prolonged consanguinity, living with their 3 children together. The children, aged between 4 and 10, presented severe physical and cognitive conditions. The oldest could not speak beyond basic sounds and had difficulty walking due to malformations in the legs. "What we witnessed here is not just the result of generations of consanguineous marriages," concluded Holloway, "but the culmination of decades of social, educational, and economic isolation. These families are trapped in a self-perpetuating cycle of extreme poverty, ignorance, and disease." The medical team tried to offer assistance, but encountered significant resistance. The older members of the dispersed community refused any contact with outsiders, and even those who accepted basic medical assistance often disappeared before scheduled follow-up visits. In 1967, as part of a broader initiative to document conditions in the most remote regions of the Appalachians. A team of documentarians from the University of Kentucky tried to locate and film some of these isolated groups. Their attempt was largely frustrated by deeply rooted distrust and extreme geographic isolation. However, they managed to briefly interview a man who identified himself as James Dawson, then approximately 40 years old, who lived alone in a rudimentary cabin at the top of a mountain. James presented subtle but distinctive physical features, extra fingers on both hands, which he kept hidden in gloves even during the hot summer, and a pattern of speech that interviewers described as simplified but functional. "My family has always been here," said James in the recorded interview, preserved in the university archives. "We will always be from here. The world down there has no place for people like us." When questioned about his childhood and extended family, James became visibly uncomfortable. "We were many before. Now we are few. It's better this way. Fewer mouths to feed." The documentary was never completed, but the director's notes offer valuable insights. What we found was not a degenerate community, as sensationalistically described in some previous reports, but the broken fragments of families that, for generations, were pushed themselves to the most extreme margins of society. The tragedy is not just in the evident medical conditions, but in the complete dehumanization that these people have suffered, both from outsiders and, apparently, within their own family structures. In 1972, a detailed genealogical study conducted by the Department of Anthropology at the University of Tennessee attempted to map the complete family history of the Dawsons and related families. Using historical census records, birth and marriage certificates, land ownership records, and interviews with older residents of the region, researchers managed to construct a partial family tree extending back to 1850. The study revealed that the three original families, Dawson, Hartley, and McAllister, were in fact already related by marriage before settling in the Pine Mountain Valley. All descended from a small group of Scotch-Irish settlers who had migrated together to America in the 1820s and had maintained close ties ever since. "What we observe here," concluded the study, "is an extreme case of what anthropologists call the founder effect, when a new population is established by a very small number of individuals from a larger population. The limited genetic base, combined with severe geographical isolation and endogamous marriage practices, created a perfect storm of genetic homozygosity. The 1980s brought profound changes to the Appalachians. The expansion of mining, construction of new roads, and advancement of telecommunications significantly reduced the isolation that had defined the region for generations. Communities that were once practically inaccessible could now be reached in a few hours by car. In 1983, a team of researchers from the University of Kentucky School of Medicine, led by geneticist Dr. Catherine Reynolds, initiated a comprehensive study on the long-term impacts of consanguinity in isolated Appalachian populations. Using recently developed techniques for genetic marker analysis, they hope to identify specific patterns of homozygosity associated with medical conditions observed in these populations. With the help of historical medical records and genealogical information collected in previous studies, the team managed to locate and obtain consent from 37 individuals identified as descendants of the original Pine Mountain families. These participants were now dispersed across various counties in Kentucky, Virginia, and Tennessee, many living in small towns and having partially integrated into the broader society. The results of the study, published in 1986 in the Journal of Medical Genetics under the title Long-Term Effects of Extreme Endogamy in Isolated Populations, a Case Study of the Appalachians, revealed disturbing genetic patterns. Even after several generations of outmarriages, wrote Reynolds, participants demonstrated significantly higher levels of homozygosity than the general population. In particular, we observed multiple rare genetic variants occurring at unusually high frequencies, consistent with the founder effect, followed by genetic drift in isolated population. The study identified 14 rare genetic variants associated with specific medical conditions that occurred at frequencies up to 20 times higher in this population than the national average. These included genes associated with polydactyly, extra fingers, syndactyly, fusion of fingers, congenital heart defects, and various syndromes that affect cognitive development. One of the study participants, Michael Dawson, then 42, had been born in the original community in 1941 and removed by social services as a child after the death of his parents. Adopted by a family in Lexington, he received formal education and eventually became an accountant. Michael, who was born with syndactyly in the feet and congenital heart problems that required multiple surgeries throughout his life, offered a unique perspective as someone who had lived both inside and outside the isolated community. For a long time, I tried to forget where I came from, Michael reported to researchers. I changed my surname, invented a new past. But the doctor's questions never stopped. Is there a family history of this condition? Were your parents related? Eventually, I had to face the truth about my origins. Michael revealed that after years of therapy, he had decided to reconnect with his family roots. In 1979, using public records and the help of a private detective, he managed to locate some distant cousins who still lived in rural areas of Kentucky. What I found was deeply disturbing, he reported. Many of my closest relatives had already passed away, some very young. Those who remained lived in conditions of extreme poverty, many with severe health problems. The most shocking was that, even after all they had suffered, some still defended the old practices that had caused so much harm. One of the cousins Michael found, Joseph Dawson, had been born in the original community in 1945 and remained in the region. Joseph presented distinctive physical features, very short stature, asymmetric face, and 6 fingers on each hand. He lived alone in a small mobile home on the outskirts of a mining town, supporting himself with occasional jobs and government assistance. Joseph told me that when he was young, our grandfather Elijah used to say we were special, chosen by God to be different, reported Michael. He believed that until the end. But Joseph said something I'll never forget. We're not special. We're just what happens when people are too afraid of the world out there. Dr. Reynolds's study revealed another disturbing aspect. Even among descendants who had integrated into broader society and married people without family relation, the genetic impact of historical consanguinity persisted. Recessive conditions continued to appear at abnormally high frequencies, a reminder that genetic legacy can last many generations beyond the practices that caused it. In 1990, an informal census conducted by social workers identified approximately 120 individuals in 3 states who could trace their ancestry directly to the original Pine Mountain families. Of these, about 70% presented some medical condition potentially linked to the history of consanguinity, ranging from mild manifestations like extra fingers, easily correctable surgically, to severe conditions like profound cognitive deficiencies and fatal heart defects. What began as a story of 3 isolated families in the 1880s resulted a century later in a diaspora of suffering that affects hundreds of lives to this day, concluded Reynolds in her final report. This is perhaps the clearest and most tragic example of the long-term impact that extreme isolation and endogamous marriage practices can have on human populations. In 1997, 50 years after Dr. Caldwell's initial visit to Pine Mountain, a team of documentarians visited the original area where the community had established itself. What they found were only ruins, stone foundations covered with vegetation, an abandoned cemetery with simple tombstones marked only with initials and dates, and the deep silence of the mountains that had sheltered so many untold stories. One of the last interviewees of the documentary was Emma Hartley, then 78, one of the few survivors of the original community who had managed to escape in her youth. Living in a nursing home in Bristol, Tennessee, Emma offered a lucid testimony about the last days of the original community. When authorities started showing up in the 50s, fear spread like fire, she recalled. The elders said they were going to separate us, take our children away, put us in hospitals for people like us. Many fled deeper into the mountains, others dispersed, trying to blend into small towns where no one asked too many questions. Emma had escaped in 1951 at 32, taking with her her 4-year-old son, who had been born with a congenital heart condition. She established herself in Bristol, where she worked as a cleaner and eventually married a local widower. "My son died at 12, revealed Emma, with tears in her eyes. "Doctors said his heart simply didn't form right. I knew why, even if I couldn't tell them. I carry that guilt with me every day." The documentary, titled The Forgotten of the Mountains, was shown at some regional festivals, but never obtained national distribution. However, its impact was significant among researchers and public health authorities, bringing renewed attention to isolated communities that still existed in the most remote corners of the Appalachians. In 2002, Dr. Thomas Richardson, a geneticist at Vanderbilt University, published a comprehensive study analyzing the long-term impact of the founder effect combined with consanguinity in mountainous populations of Eastern America. Using advanced DNA analysis techniques, he identified what he called distinctive genetic signatures in certain isolated populations. "What we observe in descendants of the Pine Mountain communities and similar is not just the direct result of consanguineous marriages," explained Richardson, "but the compound effect of multiple factors. A founding population already genetically limited, centuries of geographical isolation, and endogamous marriage practices. These combined factors created genetic islands, where certain rare variants became surprisingly common." Richardson's study identified specific patterns of genetic mutations that occurred at frequencies up to 40 times higher in these populations than the national average. Particularly concerning were variants associated with congenital heart conditions, which continued to affect descendants even several generations after the end of consanguineous marriage practices. One of the most notable cases documented by Richardson was that of Amanda Dawson, name changed to protect her privacy, born in 1975 in a small town in West Virginia. Although her parents were not close relatives, both descended from different branches of the original Dawson family. Amanda was born with a rare form of congenital heart defect that required multiple surgeries throughout her life. Amanda's case illustrates how the genetic impact of historical consanguinity can persist for generations, explained Richardson. Even when marriages between close relatives cease, certain genetic variants already concentrated in the population can continue to cause problems when two carriers, unaware of their distant relationship, have children together. In 2005, a University of Kentucky extension program initiated a genetic education project specifically targeted at rural Appalachian communities with documented history of extreme isolation. Led by Dr. Jennifer Morris, a geneticist and native of the region, the program offered free genetic counseling and testing for people who suspected having ancestry in historically isolated families. "Our goal is not to stigmatize these communities or expose painful stories of the past," explained Morris in an interview with the Louisville Courier-Journal, "but to help people understand their potential risks and make informed choices about their health and that of their families." The program faced initial resistance in some areas, where the theme of historical consanguinity remained deeply taboo. However, by working with local community leaders and emphasizing practical health benefits, it gradually managed to gain acceptance. One of the program participants, Robert McAllister, 45, discovered through genetic testing that he carried 3 rare genetic variants associated with potentially serious conditions, all linked to the consanguinity history of his ancestral family. 2 of his 3 children had also inherited some of these variants. "I never knew much about my family history," reported Robert. "My parents didn't talk about it, and I grew up thinking we were just a common family in the region. Discovering this connection with a past I didn't even know existed was shocking, but also enlightening. Now I understand why certain medical problems seem to affect our family so much." In 2010, Dr. Morris published the results of 5 years of the program in the Journal of Community Genetics. The data revealed that, among more than 500 tested participants, approximately 35% carried at least one rare genetic variant associated with historically endogamous families of the region. This number was surprisingly high, considering that many participants had no prior knowledge of connections with these families. What our data shows is that the genetic impact of these historical communities has spread much further than initially imagined, concluded Morris. Through decades of migration, marriages between communities and the gradual integration of these families into the broader society, certain genetic variants have dispersed widely throughout the regional population. In 2015, a follow-up study conducted by Morris's team used advanced genomic sequencing techniques to precisely map the dispersion of specific genetic variants associated with the original Pine Mountain families. The results were visualized as a genetic heat map covering parts of 5 states: Kentucky, Virginia, West Virginia, Tennessee, and North Carolina. The map revealed surprisingly high concentrations of certain variants in urban areas like Knoxville, Roanoke, and Charleston, cities to which many descendants had migrated in search of economic opportunities in the 1960s and 1970s. What began as an extremely localized phenomenon in remote Appalachian valleys transformed over generations into a genetic legacy that affects populations in a much larger geographical area, explained Morris. This is not just a historical or medical curiosity, but a reminder of how the past, even a past we try to forget or deny, continues to influence the present in profound and sometimes invisible ways. In 2020, the last comprehensive investigation into the legacy of Appalachian endogamous communities was published by the Center for Human Genetics at the University of North Carolina. Using extensive genomic databases and electronic medical records, researchers managed to track the prevalence of 27 specific genetic variants associated with the original Pine Mountain families. Our estimates suggest that up to 75,000 people currently living in the Appalachian states may carry at least one of these genetic variants, reported the study. The vast majority of these people probably completely unaware of their connection to these historical communities. Today, almost 75 years after Dr. Caldwell's initial visit to the isolated community in Pine Mountain, the original valley is deserted. The rustic cabins long disappeared, with only some stone foundations and a small abandoned cemetery as silent witnesses to a history that most would prefer to forget. The descendants of the original families are now dispersed throughout the country. Some know their family history, many do not. Some still carry the visible marks of this history in their bodies, distinctive facial features, extra fingers, or scars from surgeries to correct congenital heart defects. Others show no external signs, but carry invisible genetic variants that may manifest in future generations. The legacy of Appalachian consanguineous communities remains a sensitive topic in the region, rarely discussed openly. However, for medical researchers, geneticists, and historians, it represents an extraordinary case study on the long-term effects of extreme isolation and endogamous marriage practices in human populations. As Dr. Morris observed in her 2022 lecture at the annual conference of the American Society of Human Genetics, the history of the Pine Mountain families is not just a curiosity of the past or an extreme case of genetic isolation. It's a powerful reminder of the fundamental interconnection of all human beings and the profound risks of isolation, be it geographic, social, or genetic. When communities completely close themselves off, whether by choice or circumstance, the consequences can echo for generations. If you watched until here, it's because you enjoyed this story. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until here," so I can get to know you and know who really likes the stories here on the channel. Don't forget to leave your like and share this video with people you believe would also be interested in this historical investigation about one of the darkest and least known chapters of American rural history. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. Stories like the Dawsons are only preserved and documented thanks to your support. Each subscription helps us continue investigating and revealing cases that official history would prefer to forget.